All right, class, this week we're going to be talking about the 1920s, or as it's commonly known, the Roaring Twenties, which is somewhat of a misnomer, as you'll find out this week. So, the 1920s are widely regarded as a time of widespread wealth and prosperity for the entire nation. When we think of the 1920s, we think of, flapper girls, prohibition, the stock market doing really well, those sorts of things. And it gives us an idea that everyone was just doing really well. But as you've probably guessed, that's not exactly true. We've already discussed how African Americans were struggling during the 1910s to improve their own situation. Immigrants also struggled during this time. But also, the entire idea of what it meant to be American was changing. Uh, as we talked about during the Progressive Era, America was now a full on consumer society, which meant that freedom meant being able to buy things and enjoy leisure time, those types of things. And it was a real important aspect of American identity. Everyone wanted to be able to participate in this consumer society, especially women and minority groups. And while others were unwilling to spread the wealth around, because that would mean that they would have to give up some of their own power and authority, and which they had enjoyed since the founding of the United States. So you see a lot of similarities between the Roaring Twenties and the Gilded Age. One of the other things that we see during the 1920s is the birth of a religious movement called Christian fundamentalism, which we'll get into. And that involves the Scopes Monkey trial, which was very famous, which you've probably heard about. The 1920s also saw a shift in demographics somewhat in relation to politics. Now, I'm sure you've all heard the term, the Republican Party is the party of Lincoln, which is true. Lincoln was a Republican, but since the end of the Civil War, since the end of Reconstruction, really, we've slowly been seeing a shift in the Republican identity. And in 1920, that shift is pretty much complete. Warren G. Harding wins the presidency in 1920, and he is largely regarded as the most corrupt president in American history. His campaign slogan, though, was a return to normalcy. Now, if you'll recall, last week, or 2 weeks ago, we talked about the Progressive period, and then last week we talked about World War One. Well, return to normalcy was, the Progressive period had just kind of run amok. People didn't know what was happening anymore. And here comes Warren G. Harding, who at the time was massively popular as a Republican, and he says, look, we're going to get back to the way things were before, back to when things were normal. And essentially he's referring to the Gilded Age. So at the time, Harding was extremely popular. But he brings in all of his good time buddies into his cabinet, and they are called the Ohio Gang. And they get all the important positions. For example, Attorney General was named Harry Daugherty. He took bribes to not persecute criminals. Charles Forbes was the head of the Veterans Bureau and sold government supplies. We do know that Harding knew about this and did nothing about it. And then, of course, there was the infamous Teapot Dome scandal, in which Harding's friend, Albert Bacon, he was the Secretary of the Interior, and he was accepting bribes from big oil companies to lease all the oil reserves in the West, which was supposed to be reserved for the U.S. Navy, and so they got kind of, screwed over. And also, character-wise, Harding was not very presidential. He drank a lot, even during Prohibition. He fathered a child outside of his marriage during his presidency. And so, nowadays he's largely, and this is probably the most important part, he started the nation on a path that would ultimately lead to the Great Depression. So he dies in office, and another guy takes over named Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge was character-wise better, but policy-wise not much of an improvement. He wasn't corrupt per se, but he did let big businesses get away with a lot. which ultimately would lead again to the Great Depression. So the Republicans had been pro-business since the 1890s, but the Democrats had been arguing for more regulation, and now you see that, that those two identities fully embraced. The 1920s was also a time it was a hard time for immigrants. The Immigration Act of 1924 limited immigrants from Europe. However, Mexican immigrants had no limitations because farmers needed their labor. Asians were also banned from everywhere except from the Philippines. Filipinos could still come because Philippines was a colony. And during this time, we also see the creation of the concept of an illegal alien. So in 1921, President Harding gives a speech in which he laments the fact that race conflict was a global problem. He's sad that the different races are not getting along, but then he goes on to say that African Americans were not equal and should be relegated to second-class citizens. Okay, so the 1920s was one of the most turbulent times in U.S. history. And in order to understand the Great Depression, you have to understand the 1920s. So I present to you now the Roaring Twenties.